Now let us go to the next question. Charcot's joint, typically where all the scenarios do you come across? Charcot's joint patients will present with joint dislocation, pathological fracture, debilitating deformities, and it is the weight bearing joints which are involved in those who are having sensory neuropathy are the typically affected individuals. So diabetes, syphilis, chronic alcoholism, meningomyelocele, spinal cord injury, renal dialysis, congenital insensitivity to pain will be there in certain individuals. Amyloidosis is another important common cause, peroneal muscular atrophy. Whenever there is a sensory dysfunction, then these weight bearing joints will show this picture. Common question, what is the most common cause out of this? It is the diabetes, which is the most common cause for the Charcot's arthropathy is what need to be remembered. Let us talk about the metabolic acidosis. What are the causes for it? Once more, acidosis is divided into high anion gap and normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. What is anion gap, doctor? It is sodium plus potassium, not magnesium, calcium. They are all invisible cations, unmeasurable. Chloride plus bicarbonate need to be subtracted from sodium and potassium. So that is called anion gap. When will anion gap will increase? Whenever the protein, sulfate or organic acids like ketone bodies or uremia, uric acid, urea, etc., lactic acid, if they happen to increase, what will happen? The unmeasured anions will increase and the measured anions typically become, unmeasured anions will increase, and that will cause the anion gap also to become increased is what need to be remembered. There is a small paradox in this. When unmeasured anions, protein, sulfate or any of the organic acids like ketone body increase, why will anion gap will increase? So in anion gap we are subtracting chloride and bicarbonate from sodium. What are we subtracting? Anions from cations we are subtracting. Indirectly what we are doing? Sodium is called as measured cation. Chloride and bicarbonate is called measured anion. So measured cations minus measured anions will give us indirectly what we are doing? Unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations is equal to measured cations minus measured anions. You got my point? See, basically the sodium is the measured cation and you have the magnesium, calcium, which are the unmeasured cations. So measured cations plus unmeasured cations is equal to measured anions plus unmeasured anions. Rearrange this equation, doctor. If you rearrange, what will you get? Unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations is equal to measured cations minus measured anions. So this actually is calculating what? This anion gap is actually calculating what? It is calculating unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations. So anything that makes unmeasured anions increase will cause anion gap also to increase. That is the reason in diabetic ketoacidosis, etc., it become increased. I think we unnecessarily got into this. We need to have all that on the board, that makes it easier, but we are all LCD projected teachers, right? So actually we discussed this somewhere in our earlier discussions in a big detail. So that's the reason, don't worry about it. Now, what will cause an acidosis but a normal anion gap? Anything that causes a fall of bicarbonate, same time a rise of chloride. Like a hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis will not affect the anion gap because this fall of bicarbonate is compensated by the rise of the chloride, right? So that is what need to be remembered. Now, what are the causes for it? Diarrhea can cause the bicarbonate to be lost from our body and that can lead to development of acidosis very much. Then similarly, renal tubular acidosis is a cause for normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Ethylene glycol is the cause for normal or abnormal. So it is also another important cause. just like lactic acid etc. for the development of the acidosis. Now let us quickly go to the next question. Smoking is one of the causes where the basal metabolic rate can become typically increased. Let us talk about giardiasis. This parasitology is one topic, doctor, we have to read, no way. Which is infective form, is it cyst or trophozoite, how many nuclei are there in each of them? They are very small nitty gritty of parasitology. Tell me, will trophozoite and cyst both will have 4 eyes? Or something will have 2 eyes and 4 flagella and other will have 4 eyes and no flagella? So let us talk about it. So you have trophozoite and cyst, 2 different forms of giardia. The motile replicating feeding form is trophozoite. After encystment it becomes cyst, which is passed in feces and it is resistant, and it is the infective form, cyst. Now how to describe the cyst? Cyst is the infective form, it has got 4 eyes, nuclei, and typically it is oval, is what you are able to see here. Whereas trophozoite is pear shaped and it is distally convex and it is a flattened parasite. 2 nuclei are there but 4 flagellae are there. That's what our biology teacher also taught us. It is very important because as a microbiologist the routine job is to check for the stool for ova and cysts. That's the reason you must know which cyst will float in bile, which will not float, which will have 4 eyes, no eyes, etc. etc. Okay. Then what are the other reasons you want to remember giardia? It is typically common in those who have hypogammaglobulinemia, and also those who have an intestinal disease, cystic fibrosis, HIV positive individuals also it is more common. It can cause diarrhea, abdominal pain, weight loss, growth retardation and etc. etc. That is the reason we want to remember giardiasis. Let us talk about the zinc deficiency. In which foods zinc is very abundantly present, doctor? As a clinician you must advise your patients. Oysters, beans, nuts, almonds, whole grains, pumpkin, sunflower. If somebody earns for us we can eat all that, but not always possible, right? Now hair loss, skin lesions, diarrhea, wasting of body tissue, and also a change in the eyesight, taste, smell and memory, and acrodermatitis enteropathica, and brain development become abnormal. Leukonychia will be there, acne also, zinc deficiency is implicated. So many things about zinc deficiency, at least acrodermatitis enteropathica we have to fundamentally remember. Now there is something called a phenomena of malnutrition, induced malnutrition, where zinc is implicated. Why? Those who have a zinc deficiency, they typically have a less appetite. Hence in anorexia nervosa, which is primarily a psychiatric illness, they implicated that it is the zinc which is responsible. Whatever it is, if malnutrition leads to zinc deficiency, zinc further brings down the appetite, and that's the reason further malnutrition is it predisposes to. It's called malnutrition, induced malnutrition. Zinc deficiency is associated. Now let us talk about the continuous murmur. We have diastolic murmurs, systolic murmurs. Quickly tell me, doctor, mid-diastolic murmur, where do you see? Mitral stenosis. Early diastolic murmur, in aortic regurgitation you come across in the neo-aortic area. Then pan-systolic murmur, mitral regurgitation, VSD in the initial phases. Then you have the mid-systolic clicks, which can be found in mitral valve prolapse, and ejection systolic murmur, aortic stenosis, and it doesn't respect systole diastole, it will be throughout, which is called machinery murmur, continuous murmur, which is seen in the case of the PDA is what need to be remembered. So PDA, pulmonary arteriovenous fistula, intercostal arteriovenous fistulae, venous hum, coarctation of aorta, mammary shuffle, right-sided coronary cameral fistula, they are all the reasons for the development of a continuous murmur. Without taking a breath of inspiration, you must answer in tomorrow's DNB exam. Your examiner minimum expects you. Now the question is, you all heard of rupture of sinus of Valsalva. So I too heard it many times. So until working in cardiology, I could not really realize it. At least where is the sinus of Valsalva, doctor? So typically the sinus of Valsalva is located it is the dilatation in the aortic valve immediately superior to the attachment of the 3 aortic valvular cusps. It is a small dilatation which is developing. All of you know that the root of aorta is the place from where the coronaries typically take a origin. What is the reason for angina that you see in a patient who has got an aortic stenosis, doctor? Typically in aortic stenosis, the perfusion of these coronaries which are taking an origin at the level of the aortic root become diminished. That is the reason typically they develop an angina. So that is the reason, doctor, the point where these coronaries are taking an origin from the root of the aorta, there can be a development of an aneurysm which is called the aneurysm of sinus of Valsalva. If at all it happened to rupture, that also can lead to the development of a continuous murmur. Naturally, when there is a sinus of Valsalva, a lot of sinuses are possible. Right side, left side, 3 sinuses of Valsalva are there. Out of all, which is most common? It is the right coronary sinus is the most common site of the sinus of the Valsalva's rupture is what need to be remembered. Giving antibiotics as a part of the pre-operative protocol is a common practice. So where do you give that? You give it highly recommended in colorectal surgery, also in the case of the contaminated surgery, gastric ulcer surgery, in all the scenarios in fact you will give the antibiotics as a part of the prophylaxis is what need to be remembered. Now let us talk about the inflammatory bowel disease. How do you want to manage it as a surgical gastroenterologist or a gastroenterologist, doctor? Medical management. But certain scenarios, they are the indications for operation in case of inflammatory bowel disease. Let us talk about that. The most important is the inflammation which is uncontrollable in spite of giving your sulfa derivatives, etc., is the indication. Similarly, any high grade dysplasia, because ulcerative colitis patients are highly vulnerable to develop colonic malignancy. That's the reason if you identify that on biopsy, indication for surgery. Presence of the strictures and the unacceptable quality of life, they are all the important indications. Now what type of surgery do you want to do for this? Total proctocolectomy is considered to be the most important choice. What is the difference between proctocolectomy and colectomy, doctor? Colectomy means only colon, procto means even rectum also is being removed. So total proctocolectomy is a choice. Second is, after doing total proctocolectomy, what is left over? Small intestine is left over and anus is left over on the other end. Which part of the small intestine? Ileum. So that ileum and this anus are bound together, called ileoanal anastomosis after total proctocolectomy is the most common surgical procedure which is used in the case of ulcerative colitis management. You can also leave one ileal pouch, though it is technically a demanding process, you can do that. Let us look into the same thing, doctor. You have the ileum and you have the intestine, that is the colon and the rectum, all of them are being removed and ileum is opened out as a blind pouch through an ileostomy, that is one possibility. Second is you can do only colectomy without affecting, if at all the rectum is not involved, then you can preserve the rectum, that is another choice available. Then what is that ileostomy called as? Brooks ileostomy. So you can do a total proctocolectomy with Brooks ileostomy is one of the procedures that can be done. Now let us talk about the Crohn's disease. Crohn's is transmural or ulcerative colitis? Crohn's. That's the reason there can be a development of strictures, fistulae, unrelenting bleeding, they all stand as the indications for the operative surgery. So you can do a segmental resection, that is one possibility, and you can do the stricturoplasty so that you won't induce any morbidity. You can also do ileorectal or ileocolonic anastomosis, or you can do a diverting ileostomy, different procedures which are available for you. So now you are very sure how a total colectomy with the ileorectal anastomosis can be done, where the rectum is left like a wonderful pouch after removing the colon only. That is one way of doing. Other is called the restorative proctocolectomy. What is the meaning of this? Here colon and rectum are removed and the anal canal and the sphincter is untouched, and they still have the continence retained with them. And typically you will be leaving initially one stoma after removing the colon and rectum, and after the lower end heals, then that stoma is closed, and then you bring that ileum and then join with the anus. So that is typically called the restorative proctocolectomy. What is restored here? Continence is restored by restoring the anal sphincteric activity is what need to be remembered. So this is how the sphincteric activity of the anus is retained, and the colon and rectum are removed, and temporary ileostomy is placed. After that, ileostomy is being closed, and then later on there is a J pouch created in that leftover anus, which is connected with the ileum, the small intestine. That is called restorative proctocolectomy. Everything has got its own advantages, disadvantages. Especially if you try to restore, what will happen? Cholesteatoma or anywhere, there is a recurrence more common. But by restoring and being less invasive, what is the advantage? You preserve the quality of life. So too much of surgery removes the disease and removes the quality also. So both the advantage, disadvantages. Now let us talk about Hirschsprung's disease. All of you know Hirschsprung's is a male predominant, not female predominant, and typically around 90% of the patients are in the newborn period it is being identified. If Hirschsprung's occur in female, what is its peculiar nature, doctor? Long segment Hirschsprung is more common in females than in the case of the males. So you have the Meissner's plexus, which is submucosal, intermuscular is Auerbach, and small mucosal. They are the three different plexuses. And this congenital aganglionosis is the one which is the underlying pathology, which is involving the Mayentrick and Meissner's. Now tell me, doctor, what are the four procedures in the management of Hirschsprung's? Common question in the exam. You have Swenson's, So's, Duhamel's and Boley. They are the different procedures. Swenson's, basically all of them, what are they trying to do? Remove the aganglionic segment and try to connect the remaining normal parts. That is what they are doing. Just they do a little less, a little more, and take credit of four different people, right? So I leave it for a quick review on the notes. Now, can Hirschsprung's can occur even in the adult? Rarely. So sometimes it can also occur in adult. One of the options given was, can it happen in adults? Rarely it can happen. Now what are the important muscles for the rectal continence, doctor? Basically the fecal incontinence can be functional because the internal anal ring got dilated because of any reason. Similarly, any pelvic floor dyssynergia where the sphincter is not relaxing or relaxing when it is not required can be responsible. Any sphincter weakness because of any stroke or any pudendal nerve injury or any spinal cord injury also can cause the incontinence. And the three muscles of the pelvic floor, they must be intact for the continence to be maintained. They include the levator ani, which is ilioischio and pubococcygeus, puborectalis, external anal sphincter. These three are the components of the pelvic floor. Any weakness of them also can lead to the development of the typical incontinence is what need to be remembered. Let us talk about the pancreatic trauma. What is the common reason in children, doctor? Blunt trauma. Big bully of 8th class beats a small bully of 5th class, that fellow develops a trauma. Bicycle accidents is a common reason. Whereas in adults it can be a penetrating trauma. So both are possible. Now in which scenario do you need an operative intervention more commonly? Most of these penetrating traumas of the retroperitoneal organ called pancreas more often lead to a significant injury that mandates surgery. But generally blunt trauma, this retroperitoneal pancreas will not be affected that easily. Most of the blunt traumas do not require surgical intervention. That is what exactly the examiner likes to ask. Always surgery needed? Not always needed. If it is always needed, why will you ask a question? Okay, so that is most important. Then Injuries can be because the penetrating mechanism, it can cause the pancreatic amylase to become elevated. This is a typical CT, which is the investigation of choice. You can see the injury to the pancreas, and also you can see the pancreatic, peripancreatic area, the collection of the blood in the lesser omentum. So this is a very important feature. So if the patient is having a stable hemodynamics, or if the CT is not showing any evidence of pancreatic injury or any parenchymal hematoma or any parenchymal edema or any retroperitoneal hematoma, nothing is there, you can conservatively manage. No need for laparotomy and repairing that. But if at all a patient of blunt trauma happen to have an abdomen is elevating, that is the indication for an operative intervention. But in most cases of the blunt injury of the abdomen, surgical resection is not necessary because they are very superficial tears, superficial hematomas that do not mandate a surgery in blunt trauma is the rule of the game. But if at all surgery is required, those who have a penetrating trauma, then you need to do exploratory laparotomy, which helps both as a diagnostic and therapeutic maneuver, drain away the retroperitoneal hematoma around the pancreas and try to repair the ductal injury, and if required a part of the pancreas need to be resected, they all need to be basically be done. Now let us go to the next question. Meckel's diverticulum typically is in 2% of population, 2 inches in length and 2 feet from the ileocecal valve. All the 3 layers of the intestinal wall are a part of it, and it has its own blood supply. And what percentage of cases will typically have heterotopic epithelium? We say peptic ulcer can occur even in Meckel's, right? Gastric mucosa may be there, pancreatic tissue may be there in Meckel's, but what percentage? 20% of cases there can be an ectopic epithelium. Examiner is very cruel. Is it 50 to 60% or 20%? After becoming MD, these are all small things, because percentages are always statistics. What is statistics? It is a hypocritic way of putting the lies in a white way, right? So 50 to 60% of cases. How can that be an intelligent question? But anyway, now there can be, if it is a silent Meckel discovered at the time of appendicitis, do you want to operate every case? Not required. If the mouth of the Meckel is wide and open, it says, please don't operate me. It is saying with an open mouth. So you should recognize that. It will shout at you because wide and open mouth if you try to cut it, right? Only if it is narrow and there is a chance of a future obstruction, etc., then only it requires a repair, is what need to be basically remembered. In the blunt trauma of the abdomen, which part of the intestine has a great chance of injury? That part of the intestine which have a lot of mesenteric adhesions, it has a greater chance of injury than the free part of the intestine. That means which part of intestine is more free? Let us talk about jejunum and ileum. It is the distal ileum which has a lot of mesenteric adhesions, and also the proximal jejunum which has a lot of mesenteric attachments. Hence it is more vulnerable to develop an injury in the blunt trauma, is what I like to underscore to all of you. So what is the cause for the blunt trauma of abdomen? Steering wheel injury, seat belt injuries, child abuse, etc. It is a proximal jejunum which is responsible. This is the typical image of the small bowel series, where you can see the dilatation of the proximal and distal small bowel with the stricture developing in the terminal part of the ileum, distal part of the ileum, and the proximal part of the jejunum. They are highly vulnerable to develop the typical injury, is what need to be remembered. What is choledochotomy, doctor? Make an incision into the bile duct and explore where are the stones located and take it out like the gems. Now when do you want to do that? Some of you are going to be laparoscopic surgeons, you must be sure. How do you do that? You will drag the gallbladder, catch the CVD, make an incision, pull out the stones. That is called choledochotomy. So what are the indications for doing this? Typically if there are palpable stones in the CVD and jaundice is there with cholangitis, that is inflammation of the bile duct, is also there, Then if the stone is visualized, intraoperative cholangiography when you have done, if it is visualized, that is an indication. Similarly, if the patient has got an intermittent coli, intermittent jaundice, that is one of the challenging situation for a gastroenterologist. Then what is the possibility of such an intermittent biliary coli? Some gallbladder stones are middle, they are slipping into the bile duct. So open the bile duct, explore it, and then find the stone and then remove it. So it is a relative indication. Similarly, if the CVD is thickened or dilated, and whenever you are aspirating bile it is white, suggestive of obstruction. Any history of pancreatitis and a dilated cystic duct, they are all considered to be the important indications. Now left-sided colon versus that of the right-sided colon in colonic cancer obstruction, what are the differences? All of you know colonic carcinoma starts like a small lesion, stage 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time 4 it is totally obstructing the colon. So this kind of obstruction with the altered bowel habit is more on the left side, whereas the bleeding, anemia, melena, they are all more towards the right side, as all of you know very well. In case of a strangulated hernia, what do you want to do? No waiting and watching. You have to immediate surgery, and IV fluids is considered to be the management of choice. Patient is having intestinal obstruction. How do you know that? Absolute constipation is an important feature of intestinal obstruction. Abdominal distension, vomiting may be there. If you take an abdominal radiograph, doctor, normally only do you find any fluid, air fluid levels? Minimum 3 to 4 are common. More than 4 air fluid levels is definite indication probably there is an obstruction. Now, I will make you little experts in abdominal plain radiograph imageology. You must be doubly sure about. What you are able to see here, doctor? Shadows don't lie. So you see loss of hostrations with dilated intestinal loops, which is a classical feature whenever the small bowel has undergone the obstruction classically here. Now let us look at this radiograph, what you are able to see here. Typically it is a small bowel, I am saying. How are you so sure about the small bowel? Typically the valvulae conniventus, which are the bowel outlines, they will traverse across the entire diameter of the bowel. That is a very important feature of the small intestine whenever it becomes typically distended. Second is, are these loops are central or are they more towards the periphery? They are more towards central. So central bowel distended is more often a small bowel rather than the large bowel is a very important rule. Whereas if you take the colonic obstruction, it is much more peripheral and it will show the hostile markings. But what is the difference between valvulae conniventus of small intestine and the hostrae that you see here? The difference is hostrae are much more, they are not continuous, whereas valvulae conniventus are much more continuous across the diameter of the bowel is a very important indication. And what you are seeing is here a massive gastric dilatation, and also there is a air in the central part, that is the small intestinal loops. You also see that even the colon, peripheral loop also has undergone the dilatation. In fact, there is diffusely dilatation of stomach and also intestine and also the colon. What could be the possible cause here, doctor? Dyslipidemia can only explain such a thing. Hypokalemia is there, then that has led to a diffuse bowel obstruction involving all the segments post-operatively is the underlying cause. This is another case of the small bowel obstruction where you can see this inverted U-like appearance of all the loops of the small bowel centrally located because of the adhesive obstruction is what need to be remembered. Now what are you able to see in this radiograph, doctor? You can see a huge dilatation of the intestine, right? And also here also it is dilated. Such a huge loop of intestine, what could be the possibility? It must be a volvulus. Two types of volvulus are sigmoid and the cecal volvulus. So this is an example of a massive sigmoid volvulus which is dilated, and generally If any other cause of intestinal obstruction is there, where will you see that? In one or the other quadrant you will see the dilated loop. In all the loops, if the dilatation is seen, you are able to see that it is a diffuse. Here it is dilated towards the liver side, and this side also it is dilated. So this kind of diffuse dilatation is only possible in the case of the sigmoid volvulus. In this case, if you pass the barium, what will you find? Barium will pass until this point, and this is the point where these two loops are merging, and here you can see that beak appearance, bird's beak deformity, which is typically seen here in the case of the sigmoid volvulus. Now this is a case of the cecal volvulus, which shows that there is a dilated cecum with no air at all distally in the colorectum, and the convergence of the medial walls of the loop typically pointing towards the right is an important indication of the presence of the cecal volvulus. And if you happen to pass the barium enema, barium is passing a little higher than the sigmoid volvulus. Sigmoid is, it won't pass to that high level. And finally after passing it is reaching, and once more you can see the bird's beak appearance towards the right quadrant, which is once more a sign of cecal volvulus, the different causes. So there is a reason, doctor, anything more than 4 air fluid levels, if you are able to find, then you think of intestinal obstruction. Let us talk about the pyloric stenosis. It leads to hypokalemic alkalosis. You find visible gastric peristalsis, which can be seen as a wave of contraction from the left upper quadrant towards the epigastrium. Between the episodes of the vomiting, the child will be eating voraciously. A very good example of the hypertrophic pyloric stenosis. And you find that nodular palpability of that stenotic area, Ramsted's operation, they are all the important buzzwords. Let us talk about the H. pylori, doctor. Do we use antibiotics for H. pylori? What are the two regimes available? Triple, quadruple regime. What do you use in triple regime? Omeprazole or lansoprazole like proton pump inhibitor. Clarithromycin, metronidazole, the combination typically is used, and quadruple means omeprazole, bismuth subsalicylate, metronidazole plus tetracycline is called as the quadruple, is what you have to error free remember the regimes commonly used, right? Now spontaneously regressing tumors, 4 tumors have that peculiar nature. Without need of your DM oncology degree, they will regress themselves. So neuroblastoma, retinoblastoma, renal cell carcinoma, malignant melanoma sometimes, they all can have a spontaneous regression. When you want to place urinary catheterization, Foley, doctor, post-operatively, which operative procedures on which part of the body lead to this retention? Especially whenever anal canal or perineal area is involved in the operative procedure, then that can lead to post-operative retention. Very common in the obstetrical procedures also. So that is the point where it is required very much. And also in carcinoma prostate with a bladder outlet obstruction, what is the best way before you decide whether chemotherapy, radiotherapy, orchidectomy, etc., etc. Till the point of taking a decision of definitive cure, you must relieve the obstruction, no? So you have to place catheter and then first relieve the bladder outlet obstruction, very important. So by the time you are in end of housemanship, walking in the ward only, you can see and diagnose the patient. Somebody carrying the what you call Foley's bag means, oh, elderly man, Foley bag is carrying means he is a case of bladder outlet obstruction with prostate cancer walking in. So that is called clinical medicine, right? Now pseudomyxoma peritonei, what is the most common cause? Ovary or appendix? How many say ovary? Nobody say, very good. So it is the adenocarcinoma typically which is involving the appendix, the mucinous tumor of it is the one responsible. I will give you a case presentation of pseudomyxoma peritonei. 45-year-old woman, decreased oral intake, easy fatigability, increasing abdominal girth, crampy diffuse abdominal pain, and in the background she has a history of cystadenocarcinoma of the appendix. when the CT had been taken, doctor, this is a classical appearance of the pseudomyxoma peritoneum. What you are able to see here? Multiple complex cystic masses of the fat density and the scalloping of the edge of the liver because of the diffuse presence of the mucinous substance. And the momentum has undergone the thickening and there is a compression of the various visceral organs. And when the ultrasound had been taken, you can see the non-mobile ascites, which has a lot of septations and echogenicity, is a classical radiological feature, and 5 buckets of mucin was removed at the time of laparotomy. In the case of pseudomyxoma peritonei, appendix is one of the important culprit. So watchful waiting, debulking surgery, cytoreductive surgery, they are all the various options available. On the 4th post-operative day of laparotomy, patient is having bleeding and oozing of the wound, no fever. What is your diagnosis, doctor? Burst abdomen is what you have to think for. In burst abdomen, what you should do? You should not burst into tears. As a surgeon I failed. Immediately reoperate and secondary suturing is considered to be the management of choice with a good IV fluids. This is a case of typhoid perforation. Following laparotomy, patient developed a burst abdomen with a fecal fistula developing. Immediately resuturing IV fluids, they are the part of the management. Whenever there is a liver abscess, there are 2 choices for you. Conservative antibiotics, manage it, or you try to remove and aspirate it, or surgically remove it. There are options. Now, when you want to do percutaneous needle aspiration, especially if it is a solitary, unisubtate, and there is a liver abscess found, but negative serological titers are there. You are not sure of diagnosis. For the diagnostic purpose, you can aspirate. If it is a large abscess about to rupture into the heart, you need to debulk it. That is another indication for a percutaneous aspiration of it. Similarly, it is causing the compression of adjacent biliary radicals and leading to the dysfunction. That is an indication. But what are the contraindications? Suppose this kind of multiple abscesses are there, from where will you aspirate? Whole liver you have to pass the needle. It's not possible. So it's a contraindication. Multiple abscesses and patient with a huge ascites along with the liver abscess. And similarly, if the patient has a coagulopathy or any biliary pathology, there are also the important contraindications. Then when do you need a surgical drainage of the liver abscess? All those contraindications for the fine aspiration. There is multiple abscesses which are loculated where percutaneous drainage is not possible, and in spite of percutaneous drainage, if still there is a recurrence, they are all indications for the surgical drainage is what need to be remembered. What is the type of malignancy that you see in Marjolin ulcer, doctor? It is the squamous cell carcinoma, as all of you know very well. So with this question we will conclude the today's session. The various oncogenes and the malignancies, let us talk about it. Where do you find BRCA1, doctor? Breast cancer, not lung. Then how about the other things? Let us look into it. In chronic myelogenous leukemia, the ABL gene on the chromosome 9 goes to the BCR gene on 22, and that forms the ABL BCR gene on the 22nd chromosome, which is called the Philadelphia chromosome, leading to the development of the CML. BRCA1 is breast cancer susceptibility gene. Now this BCL2, let us talk a little bit about it. Basically BCL2 will be forming those proteins which are called MOMP proteins, that is a mitochondrial outer membrane permeabilization proteins, they are called as. You have different products of proteins coming out of this BCL2 gene. Some of them are pro-apoptotic and some of them are anti-apoptotic out of them. Then BCL2 is typically associated with which malignancy, doctor? With the B cell lymphoma 2. And also in the follicular lymphomas also it is seen. And BCL2 is a big family, both pro and anti-apoptotic are there. So BCL2 is definitely associated with the apoptosis, and also you are having the APC the loss of it can predispose to the development of the colon cancer, as all of you know very well.